Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Washington Brief for Tuesday, September 2nd, 2025. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael Jenkins, president of the Washington Times Foundation, which sponsors this webcast. Dr. Jenkins is also president of the Washington Times Holdings, the LLC that owns the Times News organization. He's led many successful fact-finding trips to Korea for policy experts and peace initiatives to the Middle East for the Universal Peace Federation. Dr. Jenkins, welcome. Good afternoon.
Thank you, Larry, and thank you for all that you do for the Washington Brief. We're very excited about our program today that will cover the Trump-Lee summit that occurred on August 25th. We are going to look at the outstanding issues that could prove helpful for the future of the alliance and some troublesome issues. Of course, the likelihood that Kim Jong Un would be receptive to resuming a dialogue with President Trump and possibly even with President Lee Jae Myung. We're very honored to present our guest panelist, Mr. Robert A. Manning. Robert is a distinguished fellow at the Stimson Center and is author of several books, including the Global Innovation Sweepstakes, The Quest to Win the Future, also envisioning 2030. Can the U.S. keep its innovative edge? And the future of extended deterrence in Asia to 2025 and other studies of global trends. Robert has served as senior strategist at the Director of National Intelligence National Counterproliferation Center, and previous to that, Director of the Long Range Energy and Regional Global Affairs at the U.S. National Intelligence Council's Strategic Futures Group. In addition, he has held numerous roles in planning and policy development for energy, technology, and climate change issues. He's been prolific in publishing or editing essays, journal articles, and book chapters on the nuclear weapons and Asia security issues, and including China, Korea, and Japan, and regional security architecture. He was previously an advisor for policy and public diplomacy to the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Public Affairs in the Department of State, as well as an advisor to the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Our panelist today is Dr. Alexandre Mansourov, who teaches at SACE, the School for International Studies at Johns Hopkins. He's also a professor at Georgetown University. And I'd like to also welcome our moderator today, Ambassador Joseph DeTrani. Ambassador DeTrani is a former director of National Counterproliferation Center, the former special envoy for the six-party talks with Korea, and former associate director of national intelligence. He's currently a senior advisor at Sandia National Laboratories and author of The North Korean Threat, Intelligence and Diplomacy, a personal memoir published by the National Institute for Public Policy. Ambassador DeTrani, it looks like we're going to have a very good program today.
Thank you, Michael. That was a very, very generous introduction. We're fortunate today to have Bob Manning with us. He knows the Korean Peninsula. He knows Northeast Asia so well. But today we're going to be looking at a number of issues. And as Michael Jenkins just mentioned, last week we saw a summit between President Donald Trump and Lee Jae Myung, a very important summit. And that talked about some very interesting issues, important issues like the tariff. And we've reconciled our differences on that issue of the tariff with the $350 billion investment commitment on the part of the Republic of Korea to the United States. Much of that will be spent on shipbuilding, an industry we need to focus on in the United States. So a lot of good progress on trade and tariffs, also on meeting with North Korea, Kim Jong Un, the possibility of President Donald Trump reconstituting some of those previous meetings he's had with Kim Jong Un, and the possibility that President Lee would also meet with Kim Jong Un. What was not discussed was some of the other issues on the financial aspects to keeping 28,500 troops in South Korea, how we could use those troops in South Korea if indeed there's conflict in the Indo-Pacific region or in Taiwan. Will those troops be available, etc.? So there's a lot there, and the upcoming parade in Beijing. This is going to be a very major event where we have President Xi Jinping hosting many heads of states, to include President Putin and Chairman Kim Jong Un. So there's so much to discuss. And Bob Manning, over to you to dive into some of these interesting issues.
Thank you very much, Joe, and thanks for the generous introduction. What I want to do is sort of, I guess the way I would frame it is the good, the bad, and the ugly. I want to talk about an unexpectedly successful trip on one level, and what I see as the most dangerous situation on the Korean Peninsula, Northeast Asia, in the 3 decades or so that I've followed it. The Trump-Lee meeting went exceptionally well. In fact, at a subsequent talk Lee gave at CSIS, he said he was afraid of the Zelensky treatment. But that didn't happen. It was very cordial. There was a certain bond. Both men had survived assassination attempts, and both are very committed to try to reconcile with North Korea. And so that was the plus side. I think the South Korean team hit all the right notes, as Joe said. They committed to buying $50 billion in Boeing aircraft for Korean Air, $350 billion in investment, $50 billion in oil and gas. And I think the real superpower for South Korea with the U.S. relationship now is shipbuilding. The Koreans are number 2 in the world in shipbuilding. They can build a ship 2.5 times faster in Korea than they can here. And they've invested in a big naval yard in near Philadelphia. I think one of the problems is going to be they're going to have to rethink some made in U.S. laws in order for them to carry on the shipbuilding. And in my opinion, it would not be a bad idea to have some of that shipbuilding done in South Korea, because we have a serious problem with our Navy and the need for shipbuilding we've fallen behind on. And I think the South Koreans could help us accelerate that greatly. So that's one thing I would say. What didn't happen, and that was, I think the concerns about the going after churches, which the Democratic Party associates with former President Yoon, who was impeached after a military self-coup attempt, is unfortunately been a pattern in Korean politics really since the transition to democracy in 1988. And this is part of it, this sort of retribution. And of course, President Trump does a fair amount of his own retribution. So I would keep that in mind. Having said all that, what they didn't do, there was no joint statement, there was no communique. And I think, let me just touch on some of the issues that I think are going to fester in U.S. Korea. And Joe alluded to the host nation support question. The U.S. is pushing South Korea to increase defense spending, which is already, I think, 3.5% of GDP. And they've agreed. Lee, I think the one thing I will say about Lee is he's trying to shed his image as a leftist and demonstrate his strategic pragmatism. And I think this meeting was a good effort in that regard. So there's that question. And then there's a larger question about USFK is pushing the idea of strategic flexibility. And that's very uncomfortable for Koreans because the concept is in the Taiwan contingency that U.S. troops would leave and they want the South Koreans to bear the burden. And I guess I understand the logic of it, and Taiwan is certainly a big concern, although I think North Korea, and I'll get into that in a moment, the buildup they've had has made the Korean Peninsula more dangerous than ever. And I don't think, I wouldn't bet that something happens in Taiwan before it does on the Korean Peninsula. So I think that South Koreans have reason for concern, and that's going to be sorted out, I think, in coming military diplomacy. So, and another issue the Koreans are worried about is that Samsung and Hynix ship chips to China, which is important to Korean exports. So, and at the same time as Trump, even with the trade deal, we're looking at 15% tariffs. So, at a time of a very shaky Korean economy, so that's a concern to them as well. But I think it was all in all, it was a good start, and the key thing was just the personal rapport between President Trump and President Lee, and hopefully that will carry some of diplomacy through. But I do think, having said all that, looking at Northeast Asia has become more dangerous than any time that I can remember, and since the failed Hanoi summit of President Trump and Kim Jong Un in 2019, there's been a dramatic new strategic landscape created in Northeast Asia and on the Korean Peninsula, really a change in the balance of forces. There have been three strategic shifts. Number one, in 2021, when Kim announced his big military buildup, he's qualitatively enhanced his WMD missiles, nukes. Now he's got solid fuel ICBMs. He appears to have miniaturized warheads, and which has enabled him to build tactical nuclear weapons, which Putin's threatened to use in Ukraine. They're working on a nuclear sub, so he's trying to build a survivable second strike, and I think ultimately a triad similar to the U.S. And if you look at the numbers, the buildup, not just long range, but medium range, short range, working on hypersonic missiles, this is far more than he needs to deter a U.S. attack. And so one has to wonder what his intentions are. That's the one question it raises. But this buildup, and I think he felt a certain humiliation at the failure of the Hanoi summit. He was angry at the South Korean President Moon for giving him advice that didn't work, and that President Trump didn't stay and work out negotiations. And so this buildup has given him a big sense of strength. And then he got lucky in the sense of the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And that's the second strategic shift, is a very deepening partnership between North Korea and Russia that gives him a sense of it's diminished his need for diplomacy with the United States. He's abandoned normalization was historically a big priority, not just for Kim Jong Un, but his father and even his grandfather. If you go back to 1994, when the Agreed Framework started, and that's no longer true. It was striking to me that Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, when he went to the unveiling of a new North Korean resort, made the point that he thought it was understandable and Russia supported them, North Korea having nuclear weapons. And as Ambassador DeTrani knows, if you think back to the 2005 six-party talks, Russia and China were very cooperative. They ran working groups reasonably. I was in two of them. Joe was one of the leading edges of that diplomacy. And it's hard to imagine if in talks now with North Korea that China and or Russia would be supportive. And so I think he's taken denuclearization off the table in any talks. And then of course the second strategic shift is the intensification of great power competition, U.S., China, Russia. and Kim is what some call the axis of whatever with Iran. And so you have that. And the last point, and I think a very important one, is I was frankly astonished in 2024 when Kim Jong Un ripped up the whole concept of reunification that has been a dream of Koreans on both sides since the Korean War. His grandfather and his father both pushed it, and they changed their constitution. They declared South Korea an enemy state. They changed the constitution to embody North Korea as a nuclear state with a preemptive nuclear doctrine. So this is a very dangerous situation, and I think it's going to be very difficult. Let me just, I've gone on too long. Let me just say a couple of points of what I think is possible. A lot of people are talking about all kinds of new diplomatic possibilities. I guess my view is if you listen to what the North Koreans are saying, Kim's sister, I think, laid it out very clearly and emphatically a few weeks ago. She said the door is open for Trump for dialogue, but she slammed the door shut to President Lee and South Korea, even though he's made some important gestures, shutting down loudspeakers at the border and other conciliatory moves that have not had much impact on North Korea's thinking. So what I would conclude is to say, I think there is possibility of diplomacy. I think the U.S. and South Korean attitude ought to be what it is, which is open to unconditional talks. And you know, what one big question mark is what happens with the North Korean Russian relationship if Ukraine is resolved. That some people think that he'll go back to old views. My view is that I think all the core assumptions that have guided 30 years of the past diplomacy are now open to question, if not obsolete. And so the possibilities are, I think there is some possibilities for risk reduction measures, and Kim would be happy to explore arms control. Of course, as Ambassador DeTrani knows, all the agreements we've ever had with North Korea have fallen apart over transparency. So if he won't declare what his nuclear program is, how do you know if you've frozen it, for example? So I'll stop there and I hope I've given you enough fodder for discussion.
Well, you know, Bob Manning, you've given us a lot to digest, a lot to discuss. But you talked about the North Korean relationship with the Russian Federation and how that was a significant development, and certainly North Korea's support to Russia for its war in Ukraine. There's no question about that. But you also spoke about the possibilities. You cited Kim Yo-jong, the sister of Kim Jong Un, saying that there's a possibility of re-engaging with President Donald Trump, which is very positive. The negative is how they slammed the door, as you said, on any possibility of a dialogue with President Lee Jae Myung and the Lee government, and how they've now declared South Korea as the enemy, the principal enemy. So these are very very dangerous times, as you said so correctly. So let's open the dialogue, and let's look to Alexander. Let's start the conversation, Alexander.
Hey, thank you, Ambassador, and hello, Bob. Thank you for your incredible remarks, as always, very thought-provoking and comprehensive and deep. So let me share some of my takeaways from the Trump-Lee summit last week, and of course, a few thoughts about what is likely to happen in the future. Now, I do not share your optimism about the results of the Lee summit last week. You called it exceptionally good summit, unexpectedly successful summit. You know, in my opinion, the glass is rather half empty than half full. And thank God there was no kind of negative fallout from that summit. As you suggested, there was no Zelensky moment. The bar really was very low, especially as we went into the summit after Secretary of State Rubio had canceled his meeting with the South Korean National Security Advisor Lee Sun-lak. President Trump tweeted his concern about hard to understand domestic developments in South Korea. So, whether it was a partial success or a qualified failure, where somebody said, it could have been worse and we just escaped that barely. In my opinion, I tend to be more pessimistic. And as you correctly indicated, there was no joint statement, no joint communique, not even a joint press release. And contrast that with the Tianjin declaration. In Tianjin yesterday or today, leaders of 26 countries got together at the annual meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and they signed up a declaration basically stating that they're going to build a new architecture of global governance based on very different principles from those advocated by the United States and its allies. They talk about multipolarity and all that. They agreed to establish a new development bank of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, etc. And against that contrast, no written agreement, announced last week. I know you mentioned, some big deals, which apparently were made even before the summit. They were kind of reiterated during the summit. $300 billion investment, South Korean investment in the United States, at least a promise to invest $150 billion of South Korean promised purchases of the US energy. Again, a major order to buy Boeing aircraft by South Korean companies, etc., etc. But the real question, I think, is in the details. Although there was a basic agreement, at least stated publicly, on defense and security issues, but as I understand, there's still lingering disagreements on the details, especially of the economic deals and trade deals. As you know, there are people in South Korea concerned about so much investment, South Korean money going into the United States, and they ask, why not in South Korea, on the one hand. On the other hand, the details of the joint investment fund, $50 billion, they haven't been finalized yet. And some people speculate that maybe that's contingent on the deal which the United States may or may not reach with Japan first, on the Japan investment fund. And that must come first, they say, before Korea and the United States really, finalize everything on their own investment fund. And in that sense, President Lee's summit with Prime Minister Ishida was very important in the lead up to the meeting last week here in Washington, because it kind of paved the way for trilateral discussions in this regard. Also, South Korea expected, of course, a special treatment from the United States as a foreign trade partner. And yet, despite the existence of the FTA, foreign trade agreement between the two countries, they didn't get any special treatment from the United States. So you said it's a good start, and I agree it's a good start, what we saw last week. I just hope that this will not be, the end of that. And we will not see the continuation of that in-depth kind of comprehensive conversation for the remainder of both presidents' terms. I mean, you suggested that the personal relationship did seem to work between the two presidents. Probably looking at the body language, both presidents seem to be comfortable in the company of each other, not really nervous. President Trump was not really combative. He enjoyed President Lee's company. Both seem to have been really unscripted. President Lee, of course, flattered President Trump quite a bit to get into his good graces, asking whether he would build a Trump Tower in Seoul, when he would come to play golf to Seoul, and all that. To me, it was a little bit gratuitous, but nevertheless, personal chemistry seemed to have been there, and we avoided the Zelensky moment. But I still have this lingering kind of doubt whether, in the long run, that summit might prove to be a big non-event. Not only because there was no formal kind of declaration of any sort establishing any type of new kind of mechanism, institution, or relationship worked out, but okay, it could have been worse, and I agree on that one. Two issues, though, were touched upon. One was on China, of course, and it was not clear to me whether there was an agreement on China or disagreement. So if you could kind of illuminate that area of discussion, I'll agree. Where do we stand? I mean, you touched upon slightly on the role of the USFK, strategic flexibility, and its impact for Taiwan issue. But in general, I mean, the issue of China is much more than just Taiwan in the US-South Korean relationship. So if you can touch on that one, I'll appreciate it. And second, of course, the conversation on North Korea. President Lee, of course, tried to convince President Trump that he could be a peacemaker on the peninsula, and that's why to get him involved. Well, one way to get him involved in the conversation, not that President Trump needed it particularly, because he has some interest in maintaining that conversation with Kim Jong Un in any way, but in general, it doesn't seem to me as it was particularly appropriate, to talk about, Trump-Kim summit at the summit with President Lee, because that one quote kind of upstaged, overshadowed everything which was done and said in other issues. If you could kind of, especially given the fact that North Koreans are on the record, Kim's sister, kind of slamming President Lee's delusion or the wild dream of denuclearization, although she did refrain from criticizing President Trump, as a matter of fact, which some people suggested might be an indication that they're still interested in kind of pursuing normalization talks with the United States. So what's your take on this? Was it appropriate to kind of talk about Kim-Trump summit last week? And does that conversation have any legs? I mean, will we indeed see the Trump Kim summit before the end of this year, as was indicated by our president.
Over to you, Bob.
Thanks. Yeah. Well, I don't disagree with pretty much everything you said. It's a question of, in my mind, I illuminated some of the problems. We can talk about whether it's half full or half empty, but it's in either case, you end up with half. You made an important point I want to follow on. The fact that President Lee stopped in Japan first and met with Ishida was very important because, as I said, he's trying to establish himself as not as a doctrinaire leftist, but as a pragmatist. And the fact, and the Democratic Party traditionally has been very anti-Japanese, always raising the history issue from World War II and so on. And the fact that he went there didn't made it clear he was going to accept previous agreements between Japan and Korea on history, and focused on the future and the importance of deterring North Korea. So I think that was important. You're right to talk about China. I think this is going to be a bigger, going to emerge as a big issue in which U.S. and South Korean interests may not be congruent, because for what President Lee has said is he's a Korean nationalist and he wants to have he's committed to the alliance, but he wants to have he has to live there next door to China. And so he wants to have a balanced relationship, and we'll see if Xi Jinping allows that to happen. But I think that's going to be a bone of contention, as I said, because the doctrine of strategic flexibility that the U.S. is articulating, it requires. The idea is in a Taiwan contingency, the U.S. troops would leave. There was a report not long ago in the Wall Street Journal that President Trump is considering moving 4,500 troops already out of, and as Secretary Hegseth has said, China is our pacing threat, and the whole Asia policy is derivative from the concerns about China and how to counterbalance them. And so I think that's going to be an issue, because if you're looking at north from Seoul, North Korea is looming as a bigger threat than anything they've ever faced before. And so to tell them that Taiwan is more important it's a pretty hard sell. If I missed, I think I've answered your points.
Yes.
It was the first one, and the second one, of course, Ambassador DeTrani can probably restate it.
No, go ahead. Go ahead, Alexander. Go ahead.
Okay. No, I was curious about that conversation on North Korea with President Trump hinting.
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry.
Do you think it will happen before the end of this year?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's an important point. If you look at what Kim's sister said, she said it was possible only if they accepted the nuclear weapons and forgot about denuclearization. That was the one condition she put on it. And that's why I said I think there's possibility for risk reduction measures, confidence building measures in terms of notifications of exercises and an open channel of communication. There have been a lot of ideas floated around by the Washington theory class, so to speak, on possibilities. I think one thing that's been often talked about is a nuclear freeze. But as I said, the lack of transparency really makes that questionable. If you don't know what they have, how do you know that you've frozen it? So that's an issue. There are some who want to have and this came up in the previous Trump administration, some kind of end of war declaration or peace treaty. And my view on that is that could be a real illusion. In other words, peace is something it's a process where you establish it, not a piece of paper that says the war is over and we can live happily ever after. But if you want to come up with an easy win, I could see the possibility of doing something like that, drafting an end of war statement. But from Kim Jong Un's perspective, let me make one point. A lot of the things we thought that were very, and I believe were important to him, normalization with the United States, legitimizing his nuclear program, those are no, at this point, and even lifting sanctions, because he's been so successful at cryptocurrency theft that he's got billions. How did he build that big beach resort, Cancun, at Wonsan? Where did the money come from? It was cryptocurrencies that he stole. And so all those assumptions behind our diplomacy, I don't believe they any longer apply. So that means we have to rethink how we approach North Korea. And as I said, I think things are possible, but on a smaller scale.
So let me put some pieces out here, Bob, and thank you for your comments and response to Alexander's excellent questions. And as you correctly noted, you and I, going way back to 2005, were involved with the joint statement of the six-party talks, where North Korea did commit. This is Kim Jong Un's father, Kim Jong Il, commit to a complete, verifiable denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. But in exchange for what? Security assurances, economic development assistance, the provision of if you will, light water reactors for civilian nuclear energy purposes, etc. So there's a whole menu of goodies that North Korea wants, incentives, and indeed we saw this in the Hanoi summit, where Kim Jong Un made it very clear he was looking for sanctions to be either lifted or at least eased. Ease some of those sanctions. Certainly those sanctions that were imposed in 2016 and beyond are very biting sanctions, touches their economy in a significant way. And they were looking for some relief on sanctions. So there are a number of opportunities available to us, certainly over the past 4.5 years, where we could say we're prepared to talk about sanctions reduction, the sanctions lifting, a path to normal relations. We're talking about denuclearization, but that's down the road. It's not the Libya model where you have to give everything up immediately and so forth. Put that way down the road, but that should still be there because that is our ultimate objective, complete verifiable denuclearization. And I think that's where we in Japan and South Korea are totally in sync on that. And we should stay that course, but it doesn't have to be up front. So we can move towards that process and get what you just said, Bob. Get it sort of a freeze, no more, don't build any more nuclear weapons, no more fissile material, no more ICBM launches, intermediate range ballistic launches, etc. Sort of get some sort of quiescence, some sort of a stability in the region there, because right now we're looking at significant escalation. And let me submit this. I think North Korea's pivot to the Russian Federation was such a major strategic decision on the part of Kim Jong Un, where he basically said what you said a few minutes ago, Bob. He said, look, we've been focusing on the United States because ultimately we want a normal relationship with the United States. This indeed is what Kim Il-sung, his grandfather, Kim Jong-il, his father, and Kim Jong-un wants. A normal relationship with the United States. But they have not been able to get that. And the Hanoi summit, they were very disappointed in that regard. They didn't even come close to getting that. So the pivot to the Russian Federation, and now the assistance to Russia in its war in Ukraine, is so significant. And the impetus now we see this week, meetings in Beijing with President Xi Jinping, and Chairman Kim Jong Un, with other heads of state and so forth. That's very significant. And Alexander talked about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and their joint statement that they just came out with, where Beijing is talking about an alternate route Doesn't have to be the Americans, if you will, architecture for global tranquility, for global security. There could be other paths to that. And we're going to be proposing others with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and possibly now with this axis of authoritarian states and others. So let me ask you this question, Bob. I really think Kim Jong Un is prepared to meet with Donald Trump. I really think in his heart of hearts, they still want a normal relationship with the United States. And my question to you would be, what are we prepared to give? Because we keep talking about what we expect of them, even before the summit, where Lee Jae Myung, where he came out with his proposal of a freeze, a halt, and then a reduction, and then denuclearization. And then we all applauded. Well, wait a minute. What's in it for North Korea? What are we prepared to put on the table for North Korea? How are we going to induce them to come back to negotiations and possibly walk away from the Russian Federation and support to the war in Ukraine? Possibly move them in a direction that's going to bring some tranquility, stability to the region. So my question to you then, Bob, is what are we prepared? What do you think we should be prepared to do to get Kim Jong Un back to the table with the United States? And you immediately dismissed a peace agreement. Well, that's fair, but there was some discussion of a declaration that would lend itself to eventually seeking a peace agreement, because eventually we do want to end the Korean War, right? I mean, it's been a number of years, right? over 70 years, close to 80. So Bob, what would you say we should put on the table? And do you think it will go down in the history books that one of our major failures over the last few years has been our inability to keep Kim Jong Un focused on the United States and a normal relationship with the United States, rather than pivoting to Russia and China and its mutual defense treaty with the Russian Federation?
I take your points, although I guess I just don't share your optimism because, as I said, all the things you mentioned, in the past, pre-2019, they had an urgency for Kim Jong Un, and I don't believe that's any longer true. Now, never say never in geopolitics, and you might be right, and maybe if the Ukraine war ended, Russia would be less interested in, they're giving them food, they're giving them fuel, they're giving them military technology, and maybe Putin wouldn't be so interested. I don't know, but what I see is a fairly deepening partnership right now. We don't know how much those soldiers Putin is paying for those North Korean soldiers, but I bet it's quite a bit of money. And North Korea has been supplying a good chunk of Russian ammunition for this war in Ukraine, and so it's getting deeper, and so that's why I say I'm not saying he doesn't want normalization. I'm saying it's gone from important, urgent to it'd be nice to have if it doesn't cost me much. I think that's how he's thinking about it now. But as I don't disagree with what you're saying in terms of what's the U.S. What do we have to offer them? He doesn't want Trump Towers. He built his Mar-a-Lago luxury resort without Trump's help or any Western help, as I said, because their North Korean hackers are remarkably successful. They've got billions of dollars. We don't even know the number, but it's in the billions of cryptocurrency. I don't know how that's rippled through their economy, but it's and as you said, when we had sanctions in 2016, even in 2019, China was somewhat serious about enforcing them. That's no longer true. That the Russian trade, the China trade is booming. Last September, I was in Dandong on the border, And the hotel I was staying was filled with North Korean traders, for example. So there's that going on. Having said all that, I think we ought to be exploring possibilities. And I think President Trump is prepared to do that. The problem, end of war declaration, I don't have a problem with that as long as you're serious about peace being a process, not a statement. And in terms of arms control, I think it's worth exploring. The problem, as you know well, is from the agreed framework to the six-party talks, they all fell apart over transparency, right? They would never allow the IAEA full access. They would never declare what their entire nuclear program consisted of. And so if you don't know that, it's very difficult from American interest point of view to have a credible freeze. Even having said that, I think there are room for a number of risk reduction measures. I don't know what we can offer them to get a halt to missile and nuclear testing. I think that might be one area where China would be supportive of the U.S. And President Trump is looking to meet with President Xi in a summit this fall. And I think I could see the Chinese. I think the one reason we haven't had a seventh North Korean nuclear test is because that's a Chinese red line for North Korea. So that's a possibility. I'm pushing my optimism here, but I think all I can say is that we ought to be pursuing dialogue unconditionally, make it clear we're happy to talk to them, whatever they want to talk about, but understand what the new dynamics are, what the strategic landscape looks like now, because it's really transformed itself.
So Alexander, I'm going to go right to you, Alexander, but I'm going to ask Bob Manning one last question, and that's on the 28,500 troops we have in South Korea. You mentioned strategic flexibility, whether it's the Indochina region, South China Sea, or indeed Taiwan. What is the major argument against the United States having the option of using some, if not all, of those troops if there is confrontation in the Indochina region? What do you see as the impetus for a strong reluctance to see the American troops not only move away from being that tripwire for North Korea, but indeed engaging with other issues that could affect certainly the Republic of Korea if there's conflict in Taiwan or Indochina, and there could be spillover that will affect. And we saw that with the THAAD deployment and how China reacted and its punitive measures they took against the Republic of Korea when THAAD was deployed and became operational. So what do you see as the major argument about the United States having the ability to use some of our troops in South Korea for deployment in other regions if there is conflict in Indochina or Taiwan or the South China Sea?
Well, there's two levels to this. Absolutely none. In other words, if there's a Taiwan contingency, the U.S. is going to need all the elements of power it can muster. So I think the South Koreans would not be thrilled about that, but they understand that's going to happen. There's a second dimension to that, and that is the U.S. has been trying to get allies, Australia, Japan, others, to commit to a unified military operation on Taiwan. And so if you're South Korea and you've got this enormous and growing North Korean threat, and the U.S. is telling you should commit to join the fight on Taiwan, that's a very hard sell. I mean, Korea has their own interests. They're not identical to ours when it comes to that. And so this flexibility as far as I understand what USFK has been saying, that part is, I think, is doable, and I would expect it. But how hard you're going to push the South Koreans, and at the same time we're tariffing them and telling them not to cut back their exports to China. We're telling them to spend more on defense in a very problematic economy for them. So that's a very, South Korea has domestic politics too, and I think that's going to be a source of tension.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Bob. Over to you, Alexander.
Thank you, Ambassador. I have one point of clarification, an important point, and then a question. Point of clarification is simple. Bob, I always thought that the US government sanctioned North Korean cyber hackers because the proceeds from the cyber theft, at least the US government believes, goes to fund North Korean WMD pursuits. North Korean cyber warriors are not Robin Hoods. Whatever money they steal does not go to fund the construction of resorts for North Korean workers and laborers. Again, in my opinion, humble opinion, you mentioned North Korean supplies of Russian munitions for the past 3 years, amounting to from $1 to $5 billion. That's the scale. That's a huge scale. How much money they might have earned from the exports of munitions to Russia, and that's probably what funded the construction of Kalma Wonsan Resort, just like it's going to fund the construction of a new street, Saebeol Street in Pyongyang, to commemorate the heroic deeds of all the North Korean servicemen who were killed in action in the Ukraine conflict. Again, North Korean cyber criminals, they are not Robin Hoods, and the US government sanctioned them because the proceeds are used for WMD funding, not to build the resorts for North Korean people. That's one point. You may disagree, but that's my opinion. The second point on normalization, I do believe that the United States at this point has very little to offer to North Korea in the normalization talks. Security guarantees, North Korea does not need it. They have guarantees from Russia now after what the North Korean military contingent had done in Kursk. Russians now have a moral debt to defend North Korea in any situation. North Koreans always have a Chinese security umbrella. And in any way, if the United States were to offer any security guarantees in the traditional Russian and Chinese backyard, I bet those two powers, not on good terms with the United States now, they will have a veto say over that, like we see in Ukraine now. Try for Ukrainian government to get a security guarantee from Washington, and we know what the Russians think about it, or the Chinese. On the sanctions relief, China is one of the largest, the second, if not the first largest economy in the world. As long as North Korea has open trade and investment with China, they don't really care that much about what they can get from us. The same with Russia. I mean, now that the spigots are open, I mean, they're getting a lot from the Russians. We can't really replicate that, especially now that North Korea is seeing how the United States is treating its own allies in terms of tariffs and various restrictions. And even India deal, how detrimental it is to the image of the United States. Legitimacy, we'll see a lot of legitimacy tomorrow at the military parade when you'll see Xi Jinping in the center, Putin on his right, Kim Jong Un on his left. This will be the photo which will illuminate the dawn of a new era. Not Roosevelt, Stalin, Churchill, but Xi Jinping, Putin, and Kim Jong Un as the architects of a new regional order in East Asia. And North Koreans, they basically proved themselves as a fighting machine, dedicated to the mission, willing to take, their soldiers, their lives for the mission, for the leaders. Just read about the heroic.
Alexander, we're running out of time. Alexander, do you have a question, Alexander, please?
A quick question. It's about the Black Swan event. And I feel like Vice President's comments allow me to ask this question. God forbids, what if a tragic event were to happen? And we know Vice President Vance will be ready from day one to assume the leadership. But what does it mean, in your opinion, for Northeast Asia, for East Asia, for the rest of the world? Should these countries just sit on the fence and wait because of the expectation that everything will change, then things will go back to business as usual, no need to adjust? Or do you think the policies put in place by President Trump, they will last for a long time? Nothing is going to change it, even when we'll see different leadership.
Thank you, Alexander. Please, over to you, Bob. We have 1 or 2 minutes, Bob.
Okay, very quickly. Well, thank you, Alexander. All the points you made is exactly, you articulate them better than I did, what I meant by a new strategic environment and why we don't have that much I see to offer to Kim, number one. Number two, I think what we're seeing, we're in a historic interregnum globally, right? The old order is decomposing, and we still have no idea what a new order looks like. Most of China's security ideas are all baloney. The Global Security Initiative are just an elaboration of the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence from Zhou Enlai 60 years ago. There's no there. The Chinese are not willing to provide anybody with real security guarantees. That's not how they operate. And so I'm skeptical. I think the SCO is more a vehicle for grievances against U.S. power than it is an agent for creating any kind of new world order. When they start talking about all this stuff, it reminds me of the 1970s when the G77 at the UN decided they were going to have a new international order, and the U.S. was going to give them all this money. It doesn't happen. That's fantasy land. And so I think we're in a dangerous interregnum. All the balls are in the air, and nobody knows where they're going to come down. But I think there's I don't even like the term multipolar, because power has become situational. It depends on the issue, what accumulation of influence will come to bear on it. So I think but my point is that we're in a very dangerous situation. I'm not sure the Trump administration really understands how much things have shifted since 2019. That's one of my concerns.
Thank you, Bob. No, really, this is what a fascinating discussion. A lot of issues, certainly touching the Northeast Asia, the whole East Asia region, but certainly the global community writ large. We didn't talk about Ukraine. The war in Ukraine. We didn't talk about Gaza. We didn't talk about Sudan. We focused on the Korean Peninsula in this instance here, and the issues that are so important. And now the meetings that are taking place in Beijing, and literally as we speak, with President Putin, meeting with President Xi Jinping and Chairman Kim Jong Un for the 80th celebration of the end of the Second World War, and the movement in those different directions. So I think having this dialogue once a month, Michael Jenkins, and to you, the Washington Times Foundation, and to the Washington Times, thank you, Michael, for permitting us to have these discussions, because this is something that touches all people. All 8.2 billion people in the world are affected by all these events, and we sort of capsulize some of that during our monthly sessions. So thank you, Michael, and over to you, Michael Jenkins.
Thank you, Ambassador DeTrani. As always, you're such an excellent moderator and guiding us through this very, very important area of world affairs. There's nothing, I believe, more important than Northeast Asia. It connects with everything, and the six-party talks show that the epicenter of all the world leaders in terms of the nations of the world that really can direct things one way or another are all there, and they're still there. And we really appreciate such experts as Mr. Robert Manning. Always, Bob, when you come, we gain so much more insight and understanding. Dr. Mansourov, you are on the cutting edge of education and understanding and analysis. We're always happy. We want to thank the Washington Times. They cover this program, and it really gets the word out, especially in Korea. We're read there quite effectively, and the embassies all get our articles on the Washington Brief, and we get a lot of commentary. And I want to thank also the Washington Times president, Chris Dolan, for his efforts, and also the new program that's developed. Ambassador DeTrani is part of that. It's called Threat Status. So go to WashingtonTimes.com. You'll get the threat status if you sign up for it. It's a daily newsletter on the most urgent and most very crucial matters dealing with security and peace for the United States in the world. I want to thank you, everybody. That's another great program, and we'll see you next month. Thank you.
Thank you.
This webcast is pre-recorded.